What that means is that our government was complicit, absolutely complicit, not only in terms of standing, cheering and egging on, encouraging and promoting, but in actual financing, providing weapons, providing aid and support for a war crime. The go-to solution to those who are out of ideas, and I believe the government has been long out of ideas, is to try to find a scarecrow, find someone or something to blame for all the failures, or to distract. You know what? The problem isn't the fact that you can't feed your children. The problem is that we have extreme Muslim organizations.
Welcome to the Big Picture podcast. My name is Muhammad Hassan, and today we examine the British government's new definition of extremism. It was announced in Parliament by Community State Secretary Michael Gove to counter what he describes as a steady increase in extremism and religious hatred, in particular since the events of October 7th, which triggered months of mass protests in London and around the world. Gove has been deeply influential in shaping the UK's counter-terror policies over the last 2 decades, and has long argued that Western governments are far too accommodating of Islamism and political Islam. He now believes the existing state mechanisms for tackling extremism aren't going far enough.
As our new definition makes clear, extremism can lead to the radicalization of individuals, deny people their full rights and opportunities, suppress freedom of expression, incite hatred, weaken social cohesion, and ultimately, it can lead to acts of terrorism. Most extremist materials and activities are not illegal and do not meet a terrorism or national security threshold. For example, Islamist and neo-Nazi groups in Britain are operating lawfully, but they advocate and work towards the replacement of democracy with an Islamist or Nazi society.
So who is he talking about exactly? Well, he mentioned 3 groups in particular during his speech in Parliament: CAGE, MEND, and the Muslim Association of Britain, all British Muslim organizations. Today, we're talking to Anas Altikriti, a founder of the Muslim Association of Britain and one of its former presidents. He now heads the Cordoba Foundation, a think tank that aims to, quote, bridge the gap of understanding between the Muslim world and the West, unquote. I want to know how he responds to this new definition of extremism, how he feels about his own organization being caught up in the mix, and what this spells for the future of British Muslim life. Dr. Anas Altikriti, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Where to from here with regards to the definition, this new one of extremism, and this promise by Michael Gove that this is going to be the first of many steps to come in tackling what he thinks is a problem?
What has happened since Michael Gove's statement is that we have been inundated with messages of support from people often we don't know, from outside the Muslim community. Many of them, saying, listen, where do I sign up to become a member of the Muslim, although I'm a Christian? Many saying, well, since Michael Gove hates you, you must be the good guys. I have been invited to 4 or 5 public meetings and events which were held by many organizations, non-Muslim organizations invariably, in order to show support and solidarity with MAB and with other organizations that have been mentioned. We have received offers of donations from people who aren't members of MAB and aren't in any way, compelled to make the kind gestures that they are. So in a way, there was a statement of 400 imams and religious leaders that came out last week, again condemning the government and showing solidarity with the 3 organizations. Many of those imams would disagree, from, let's say, an ideological perspective with MAB or with the other organizations, yet they now feel that the government has driven them in order to show this kind of solidarity. And listen, most people understand that today it's MAB, tomorrow it's going to be someone else. And the government thinks it's being clever by sort of picking on particular organizations, so that basically creates this dilemma for the rest of the community and the rest of the ranks, the pro-Palestine campaign and the such. But what they're facing today is a unified front from everyone, from the pro-Palestine campaign, from the Muslim campaign, and from largely the British public, who see this as a cheap maneuver by the government, once again to salvage what it could just before the general election, and to somehow settle scores. The government has suffered to no end, and we know this, as a result of the protests, the daily protests for Palestine up and down the country, and it knows that it has been embarrassed by its support for Israel. In fact, that goes across the globe. Biden himself privately, describes Netanyahu in terms that can't be said or aired over this show. But everyone knows that Israel has embarrassed every single government that stood by it, and the British government is no exception. And therefore, it's in a way, it's settling scores.
There's certainly a precedent for this kind of relationship, this kind of back and forth. Sometimes it's taking place in courts, and sometimes taking place in the court of public opinion. Yeah. What are organizations, Muslim organizations, that the ones that have already been named, others that feel like they might follow suit as well? What conversations are they having? What kind of strategy are they putting into place, and what are they preparing for going into this election and possibly over the next couple of months?
I think it's a fair conclusion to say that further names will be mentioned, further organizations will also be labeled. And I think that it is also a foregone conclusion that there will be a greater sense of unity amongst desperate organizations, people who never spoke to each other before for various reasons, all of a sudden coming together and sharing platforms, because there is a widespread conviction that this is targeting everyone. But by doing this, this drip effect, it's hoping that this united stand will sort of decimate, will sort of break. So I think that's a given. I have to say that in real terms, since the 14th of March, nothing has really changed in terms of the internal operations and in terms of the wider engagement. In fact, if anything, I'm being inundated far more than I used to be in order to speak about this. More and more friends are being made. People who are coming forward and saying, we think that what the government is doing is despicable. And there is also a wider appetite and a greater appetite for this organizing of the vote, whether it be the Muslim vote, whether it be the left vote, whether it be, certain regions vote, whether it be the Palestinian vote. This is something that is happening virtually every day. Well, actually, literally every single day. And people are inclined to support this. I think that there is a deep and real political crisis, and that the go-to solution to those who are out of ideas, and I believe the government has been long out of ideas, is to try to find a scarecrow, find someone or something to blame for all the failures, or to distract. You know what? The problem isn't the fact that you can't feed your children. The problem is that we have extreme Muslim organizations. It's again, it's cringeworthy how cliche this is, but this is unfortunately part of the political crisis we suffer. We have a lack of thought, a lack of originality, a lack of ideas on every single level, including economic, security, social, political, every single level. Our foreign policy is, I would suggest, nigh on corrupt. The bringing in of someone like David Cameron, I think, is to sort of instill a semblance of respectability. Some of his statements on Gaza have been have been okay, have been positive of late, but it's too little too late. I think that we need an overhaul. Otherwise, we are at risk of breaking up society. We are at risk of seeing the government itself being the biggest proponent of deep and serious divisions, long-lasting divisions within British society, and that can't be good. What we're supporting in Israel, in comparison to our stand in Ukraine, for instance, this is not politically clever. This is, I would say, at best naive, but at worst quite bad, and it threatens of many other cases where we find ourselves engaged in a battle that is, neither moral. It has no moral standing, nor does it have any political expediency. You can understand. It's either ethical or it's beneficial. When it's neither, it's problematic to the extreme. And the problem is, looking at the conflicts which we're heavily involved in right now, it's neither ethical nor is it effective or impactful. So what exactly are we doing and where are we heading? This is the question that impacts everyone, I believe. It doesn't matter whether you're a Muslim or otherwise. If you're a British citizen living in Britain, you must be absolutely petrified.
Away from an actual legal definition, what impact does it have on an organization such as the Muslim Association of Britain, for example, or even your own?
Well, the second thing that Michael Gove mentioned after saying that basically they can't seek funds was that they can't engage with government ministers or special advisors as such. And so basically announcing that the government is disengaging with these organizations. Not that there's been an incredible amount of engagements anyway. However, the real impact and the real effect in terms of these organizations' work is that essentially being cast sort of with a question mark lingering over your head, not being condemned, but not being totally vindicated, is sometimes even worse than being, condemned, because for no reason whatsoever, you can be said, well, you're trying to book a venue for, let's say, 8 prayers or for a training session or something like that. The venue could say, well, because of this, we're not entirely sure we should, so we might as well not. Your bank will say, well, because, this has been cast on you, so, just in case, we're going to close down your account. So all of a sudden, you find yourself incapable of actually functioning or carrying out your duties, which you have been for over a quarter of a century, but without actually being condemned or actually being accused of anything particularly. Obviously, the issue of engagement with the government, I would say, is to the detriment of the government. These organizations are grassroots organizations which are involved in many aspects of the Muslim community's lives. And, for the government to say, well, you know what, we don't want to talk to you, well, that's to the detriment of government. You'd rather, I would suggest, talk to people who have their fingers in everyday events, in the public mood, in trends that are occurring with such, rather than closing them down. But that's the government's decision. It's very silly, it's absurd sometimes, it's counterproductive. But there you go. That's the government's decision. But the real impact in terms of those organizations' work and endeavor every single day is being cast in that kind of gray zone, where people are uncertain, so they'd rather. People who donate, for instance. Many of these organizations, they rely on people's donations. So imagine if those donors felt that by making those monthly transfers, that they might be also implicated somehow or accused somehow. So they stop. So you're, in a way, isolating those organizations. But also, let's also bring back the context. MAB has been part of a coalition that has been organizing the Pro-Palestine campaign for months. When you classify MAB as you have done, or as Gove has done, you sort of challenge everyone. You've not cast any problem on the 5 other organizations are in notes. But since this organizations you have claimed as being extreme, so now you're challenging everyone else. Well, do you want to continue standing with, or do you want to continue sharing a platform? That's specifically what Rishi Sunak said on the 1st of March. That you need to cast out the extremists from your midst. Indeed, the Muslim community itself, where MAP does fantastic work up and down the country, all of a sudden, you have challenged the Muslim community to cast aside this grassroots organization that has been in operation for 27 years. And the same goes for Mend and Cage, who have benefited, countless people, sometimes within the Muslim community and on many occasions outside of the Muslim community. In a way, you can say that what the government has done, it has absolved itself from all responsibility, and yet put all the onus on the Muslim community itself. You sort it out, and now everyone is somehow being challenged. What will you do now? Now that we have said that this particular organization, out of hundreds available, this particular organization is extreme, what are you going to do?
Speaking of the election and speaking of the pro-Palestine movement in particular, the government's stance on Gaza has really created a massive wedge, not only between the government and the Muslim community, but between the political establishment and the Muslim community.
Yeah.
And that is seen in the way that not just Rishi Sunak and his government are called out, but also the Labour establishment and also Sir Keir Starmer are called out by pro-Palestine groups. But then you talk about, you mentioned the Rochdale by-election and the upcoming series of elections and by-elections that are expected to be real contestation points for the mood of British Muslims, for the mood of how people feel about the policy towards Israel, towards Gaza, towards Palestine. From the government's perspective, it is seeing these Muslim organizations, these Muslim groups, finding them on the streets and finding them in the ballot box. And that, I assume, is what Michael Gove mentions when he talks about groups trying to subvert the democracy of the United Kingdom. And it is also what Rishi Sunak reacts to, and in his speech on the 1st of March, which Sir Keir Starmer essentially agreed with, didn't challenge. There is a real flashpoint right now between Muslim communities and between political establishments. What is this telling us about where things are heading? And is it too late to try and mend this relationship, or are we heading into an election with a increasingly vocal minority of Britons that do not want to engage with the political system?
Yeah. A couple of things need to be mentioned. The first is that this chasm, this split, is not exclusively between the Muslim community and the government. Actually, the government, in the way that it has stood and behaved over the past 6 months specifically, has created a split with international law. And we saw this clearly in the ICJ case, where it absolutely came out saying that it is plausible that Israel has committed genocide. Now, should that ever be found and decided, it might take years, but it's on the table. It's possible. There's, let's say, at least a 50-50 chance that a case could be found that Israel has committed genocide. What that means is that our government was complicit, absolutely complicit, not only in terms of standing, cheering and egging on, and encouraging and promoting, but in actual financing, providing weapons, providing aid and support for a war crime. Now, I don't understand whether these people understand the implication of this. Only a few years ago, we had 97-year-old security guards who served in Auschwitz and served under the Nazi regime, who were brought to the ICC and condemned as war criminals. I don't know what Rishi Sunak is thinking about. I don't know what Keir Starmer is thinking about. I don't know what the political elite who have stubbornly stood against the overwhelming public opinion around the world and stood by Israel as it continues to commit a genocide every single day, what they're thinking of what's going to happen to them, maybe after they retire, maybe in their old lives, to their children, to their legacies, to their, reputations, if found that Israel has indeed committed a genocide. I mean, this is something that we must always put on the table, that this issue, this split, is not between a particular community in Britain and the British government. This is between the British government and the entire world, including the international community, including international law. I would go further to suggest that the British government is in defiance of international law in the way that it is behaving. That's one. The second thing is, the pro-Palestine movement is not just about the Muslim community. I mean, the Muslim community might be an important element therewith, or there within. But it's absolutely every single corner, every single pocket that belongs to the British society. And this goes around the world. You're talking about European countries, you're talking about America and Canada, where hundreds of thousands of people, probably I would suggest millions of people, are subscribing to the pro-Palestinian movement, who come from all corners. What about, and this is something that in my view is the most important element of this campaign, and that is the incredible, significant Jewish voice within these campaigns. I mean, the Jews, many of whom come from parents or grandparents who suffered the Holocaust, many of whom have families who subscribe to the Zionist ideology and probably even live in Israel, many of whom come themselves from a Zionist background, and today say, listen, this is evil, and we absolutely disavow any connection with all of this. That element is probably the highlight of the pro-Palestine movement here in the UK, in America, in Canada, everywhere around the world. And that's something that the likes of Michael Gove, the likes of Rishi Sunak, fail to deal with. And therefore they have to single out a particular element born out of, and this is something we haven't mentioned yet, Islamophobia. And this is something which is deep-rooted, not only within the Conservative Party, but it is systematically institutionalized within society. And this is something that a former colleague of Michael Gove, Baroness Saida Varsi, who spoke about Michael Gove and his significant biases against Islam and Muslims. And by the way, some former colleagues of Michael Gove in Oxford, during his Oxford University days, talk about how he was part of the pro-Palestine campaign. I'm yet to verify this. But I have it in confidence and authority of people who knew him personally back then. He said, yeah, he was part of the pro-Palestine campaign. I'd like to put that to him and see how he reacts. But the problem of Islamophobia is at the root of all of this. And this is something that we must understand. Not only has the Conservative Party specifically rejected any kind of calls to review this from within its ranks, it has tried to play with words and say, well, we don't agree with Islamophobia, but maybe Muslim hatred or the such, trying to divert attention from the real substance of the issue at hand. And the fact that Michael Gove chose to label Muslim organizations, a couple of maybe far left or far right organizations added to the mix, but essentially talking about the Muslim participation and the Muslim role in the pro-Palestine and general political kind of discussion, I think is quite telling. But coming back to your question,
also his speech was said a day before the newly minted International Day to Combat Islamophobia.
Absolutely. I don't think that these are coincidences. I mean, and the fact that, for instance, Rishi Sunak went and visited the London Central Mosque, and from there made another speech, which also made it, talking about the beauty and the peacefulness and the whatever of Islam and the such. But you know what? We're going to target Muslim organizations that are at the heart of the Muslim community. It's sometimes it gets so cringy that the same ridiculous, repugnant plot is being rehashed time and time. It's as though it's textbook. It's textbook. And it's absurd how little those in government think of the general public, and that this will somehow wash. It's unfortunate, but listen, we have a political crisis at hand. And this is the point that we need to make. I mean, coming to the next election, I'm not as too optimistic and naively optimistic to think that Gaza and the massacre that we've seen unfold will be at the heart of the elections. I know for a fact that it won't. However, we need to understand, and also in completing the context we're talking about, we as a society are suffering a crisis. The cost of living crisis is something that is impacting millions of Brits. And we're talking across the board. I'm not talking here just about the Muslim community. Our NHS is crumbling. The policies of austerity have killed off the country. And therefore, this term that Britain is broken wasn't brought about by the Muslim community. It was brought about by people who are concerned with the affairs of Britain. The fact of the matter that our public sector, our health services, our education system, our transport is in crisis mode. The fact that we have millions of people teetering on the edge, with countless people, countless families unable to feed their children who on weekends or during holidays, is tragic. So the government is just using these recent events as some sort of excuse or justification in order to settle some scores. But the fact of the matter is that the general public has a problem with the Conservatives. It's not the Muslim community that will, on its own, bring down the Conservative government. It's Britain, because of how shoddily everyone in our country has been treated over the past several years. And that, by the way, is in no way stating that Labour will be any different. In fact, Keir Starmer himself, many in the shadow cabinet have come out and said, well, we're not going to change things much. So people realize that Labour is not the solution. The government needs to be brought down because it has been given 14 years, and that's 14 years too much. But Labour have not proposed any way out of this quagmire. So we need to find something else. And that is the point of discussion every single event almost that I attend, regardless of whether it's about public services, whether it's about the NHS, whether it's about Palestine, whether it's about Islamophobia, whether it's about anything. This is brought up, and people feel extremely strongly the fact that the political system is broken it's broken. And there is no hope that by changing Conservative with Labour that anything real will be resolved.
Well, let's talk about the Labour Party then, because a lot of the organising on the political side that has been taking place, or they're starting to take place, and for the first time in a lot of cases in the Muslim community, in different Muslim communities around Britain, has focused, zeroed in on Labour candidates. And the idea that there is a grievance with the Labour Party because of their perceived lack of leadership on Israel, and their lack of divergence from Britain's existing foreign policy towards Gaza. And the Rochdale by-election was kind of the first of many, and there's the Muslim Association of Britain is part of a number of organizations that have taken part in the Muslim Vote, which is a website that has a list of candidates that it encourages people to go out and actively vote against, essentially, and a large part of them are Labour candidates. Is this an initiative that you yourself have been involved in?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I'm proud to say that I'm involved in, last count, about 9 of those initiatives, including the Muslim Vote. There are many, some of them regional, local, some of them national, and some come from the Muslim community, some from other pockets of the British electorate. And the common desire is basically to express that we are fed up with the system. This is not serving us. It's it's in a way. I mean, this democracy that we're in, to end up having the only choice presentable is either the Conservative or Labour, is problematic, and it calls for a lot of apathy, which we're trying to avoid. But a lot of people are just saying, you know what, we're not going to be part of this because it's just the same as. I mean, there's a different color rosette, but apart from that, there's really no difference whatsoever. It's like in America. I mean, for instance, after hundreds of millions, probably billions are poured in presidential campaigns, you end up with someone who's bad, someone who's worse. I mean, this year we're likely to end up with Biden versus Trump. I mean, for God's sake, in all seriousness. And then you say, well, we have a democracy, people are free. No, the system is not conducive to actual choice, to presenting options to people. And Labour in Britain over the past few years, unfortunately, has been absolutely despicable in terms of how it behaved regarding specifically the treatment of Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, in 2019, we had the spectacle, which I would go as far as to say unprecedented, of Labour Party figures actively campaigning against their own party in a general election, just so that Jeremy Corbyn doesn't become Prime Minister. And people saying this out loud. I mean, for people who are bigwigs within Labour, people who are seen as veterans of Labour, actually coming out and saying, no, we'd rather lose the election. We'd rather lose the election. And it's been uncovered time and time again how the plots within the party against Jeremy Corbyn are what lost Labour the election and brought him down. And ultimately then there was this anti-Semitic fiasco, in my estimation, which again, according to an inquiry within the party, was unfounded, but caused mayhem within the party. Whatever emerged is nothing to do with Labour or what people feel should be Labour. And therefore, in my view, I mean, the fact that just before a general election, Keir Starmer takes a few prospective candidates on a jolly to Israel in the middle of one of the worst genocides that we have seen is mind-boggling. Is mind-boggling. The fact that Keir Starmer famously, however hard he tries to backtrack, it is on record that he time and time again in various studios, when asked, he said that Israel could do whatever Israel sees fit, even if cutting off food, water, aid, or the such. For someone of a legal background, for someone who's a former public prosecutor, is despicable, and it speaks of the man. And in my view, and I think that this also agrees with millions up and down the country, including the Muslim community. According to polls, 80% of Muslims who used to vote for Labour won't this time, and that I believe is quite significant. So for
and this is the momentum that this organization, this movement, the Muslim Vote, is trying to kind of capitalize on, rally around. This feeling that Muslims are feeling alienated and detached from the Labour Party, which traditionally has been the go-to for almost all of British Muslims, who make up 4% of the country, 10% of London. And it's quite a significant voting bloc that has always traditionally voted for Labour. And so this seems to be an idea of trying to turn that into something that could sway, potentially have a vocal voice in British politics. And we have a general election coming up, and we have a mayoral election coming up in London. Right. So how are you and others, in this initiative, telling people to vote, telling Muslims to vote, and what do you hope can come out of this that can serve in the interest of British Muslims?
Well, the very first thing is that, just like you said, the Muslim voice and the Muslim vote is neglected entirely from one side, from the Conservatives, and taken for granted from the other, which is Labour. So in a way, it's meaningless. You don't need to go to Muslims to ask them what their problems are, what their issues are. Despite the fact that, according to government statistics, it's the Muslim areas that are more impoverished in terms of education, employment opportunities, in terms of development and whatever. And it's off the scale in terms of mental illnesses, disabilities, and the like. But no one seems to care about what the Muslim vote, as significant in terms of number as it is. We're talking about almost 3 million, 2.83 million voices, yet no one seems to care much about the Muslim vote, when I believe they should. So the very first objective, the main objective, is to display through a trend of organizing the Muslim vote, agreeing what are the parameters that make a particular candidate a good candidate or otherwise. Not necessarily that they're Muslim, because we have seen many Muslim representatives act abysmally, and many others, including Jewish MPs, who have acted brilliantly. So the criteria and the parameters need to be agreed. And if we get a 60 to 70% coordinated move towards that, I think what could be shown is the fact that the Muslim vote matters. And that thereafter, anyone who chooses to disregard listening to the Muslim community does so at their peril, and that it's to a candidate's great benefit to engage. So I think that's the most important part. Now, of course, we want something else in Parliament. We want something else in the decision-making circles. The fact that we have the current system that we do is not conducive to democracy. This is the most important bit, by the way. We can talk about Islamophobia. We can talk about the way in which government behaves, in which the government is trying to clamp down on freedoms. But at the very heart of this is a bigger problem that everyone suffers or is threatened by, and that is the sort of descent of democracy. That is problematic. the way the media has behaved over the course of the past 20 to 30 years, particularly since 9/11, it's non-conducive to democracy. Yeah, fine, okay, the Muslim community suffered more than others, but that's not the issue. That's something that we need to talk about, but that's not the central issue. The central issue is that we have a democratic system that is at risk. And the speeches delivered by both Rishi Sunak as well as Michael Gove actually clearly signal that, that risk is real. It's not just imagined in my head or the heads of a few. This is a real risk. That it is seen, the public are told that by clamping down on public freedoms, that by clamping down on civil liberties, that by singling out organizations that haven't done anything wrong, either by law or by any other standard, but we're singling them out for certain treatment, that's okay, that's how we protect you, that's how we prosper. By peddling that, we're showing that we're on a downward spiral or trend towards, it's very difficult to associate the United Kingdom with authoritarianism or fascism or autocracy or the such. But this is how it begins. This is how it starts. Making people always on a fear mode, a panic mode. And that, as a result of this, we're going to take away a little bit of your freedoms in order to. I mean, there was a time, I recall, not so far ago, when the issue of privacy was sacrosanct. It was seen as the untouchable. But now, all of a sudden, we're talking about, when you're stopped, you have to hand over your devices. You have to hand over your passwords. You have to... And, we're hearing news about government installing software or forcing certain companies to install software so that basically it could monitor. And again, if you recall, after 9/11, we had this quite poor argument that, well, if you have nothing to hide, what are you afraid of? And we never realized that we would get to where we are today so quickly. But that's where it starts. That's the thin end of the wedge, if you wish. And unfortunately, we have this particular situation. And people around the country, millions, are sick and tired of all of this. They are in debt. They can't pay their bills. They can't warm their homes. They can't feed their children. They can't avoid the crumbling services of the NHS and pay for private care. It's utterly ridiculous, and people want change.
Thank you. We'll continue having this conversation, and we'll see what happens between now and the general election. I'm sure there's going to be more surprises to come.
Absolutely.
Thank you for watching this episode of The Big Picture, and thank you to Anas Altikriti for being our guest today. We want to hear your thoughts about this conversation and about what guests you would like to see on this podcast next. So please leave your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, you can listen to this episode and all of our episodes wherever you get your podcasts from. And until next time, salam.